Good morning. If everyone could take their seats, that would be fantastic. And we'll get started. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this rather timely and very critical discussion on the role of sanctions in influencing global security. As we approach the 4-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it's important that we take time to assess the effectiveness of the international response. In response to the war, the U.S. and other Western countries imposed an unprecedented wave of sanctions on Russia, with the goal of crippling the Russian economy and leading to a just and lasting peace. The sanctions have had measurable impact, as assessed in research published recently by Brookings scholars Robin Brooks, Ben Harris, and Leah Marshall, that was earlier this year. From 2021 to 2024, European imports of Russian oil decreased by nearly 90%. Despite this, the Russian war machine has persisted, inflicting immense suffering on both sides. The Russian economy has adapted, shifting to rely heavily on defense spending and an illegitimate shadow fleet and effectively bypassing the price cap on Russian oil. And continuing negotiations among American, Russian, Ukrainian, and European officials have thus far failed to accomplish the goal of achieving peace. So we are left to ask ourselves, are sanctions an effective tool? What lessons can we draw from the last 4 years about the power and limits of economic pressure in achieving an end to the Russian-Ukraine war? Examining these questions is the purpose of today's conversation. We have with us an exceptional group of experts who can offer insights on the last 4 years of Russian sanctions, what worked, what hasn't, and what options may lie ahead. And so I'm delighted to welcome Senator Whitehouse, Nobel laureate prize winner Simon Johnson, Dark Fleet expert Craig Kennedy, and representatives from 4 European embassies. We have Ambassador Nelly Apsiena, Ambassador of the European Union to the United States, Ambassador Varvuolis, Ambassador of Lithuania to the United States, Ambassador Allen, Ambassador of Sweden to the United States, and Lucy Ferguson, Acting Deputy Head of Mission at the British Embassy in Washington. Thank you all again for being here today and for your dedication to peace, justice, and a deeper understanding of the tools used in pursuit of both. It is now my pleasure to welcome Senator Whitehouse to the podium.
Thank you, President Rouse, and thank you to Brookings for hosting this important conversation. I'm honored to be here with genuine subject matter experts who have done such important work in this area, who you'll hear from once the politician has done speaking. But I do come to you from the United States Senate, which is, among other things, a bulwark of support for Ukraine. If you look at the senior chairman on the relevant committees, Chairman Risch, Chairman Wicker, Chairman Grassley, Chairman Graham on Foreign Ops, they are all uniformly and staunchly committed to Ukraine. And each of them has a Democrat ranking member who is equally and staunchly committed to Ukraine. So the Senate, I think, is a very important place in this conversation. I will say that there's also a Ukraine Victory Caucus that myself, Senator Sullivan, Senator Graham, and Senator Blumenthal established during the days of woe and gloom and doom, when nobody would use what we called the V word about the contest between Russia and Ukraine. And I think over time, it's been more and more shown that Ukraine actually is in a place, if properly supported, to gain a victory. And frankly, to gain an important victory, because there's a lesson here behind the immediate conflict, which is, can you do well by invading peaceful neighbors? And if you can do well by invading peaceful neighbors, don't think that the Chinese won't be watching. So this is a point that needs to be made. And so I'm delighted to have been a part of the Senate work. I'd also point out that we're going back to vote on the National Defense Authorization Act. And in the Senate National Defense Authorization Act, there is funding for Ukraine for its own defense. There is funding for NATO, as always. There is a requirement that troop deployment in Europe not go below a certain number. And there is support for the Baltic security package. So it's not just talk in the Senate. Our defense authorization bill runs in dramatic and direct conflict to the security report that the Trump administration put out. Obviously, if you're in the executive branch, a handful of people who control the report can come up with all sorts of unfortunate ideas, but I don't think that that even reflects the views of the career professionals in the Trump administration, and I think the NDAA is a very strong statement against it. We are also trying to push for a package of bills. Senator Graham, I would say, is the most enthusiastic proponent of pulling this package together, and he is in constant conversation with Majority Leader Thune about the enhanced sanctions bill, Repo 2.0, and designating Russia as a state sponsor of terror related to the kidnapping of so many Ukrainian children. So if that package were brought to the Senate floor and it would pass overwhelmingly, I think there are 85 sponsors on the sanctions bill, just for starters. That would be another very, very strong signal in favor of Ukraine. So moving on from the Senate to sort of where we are out there in the real world, I think the two most important things that are happening are the enforcement of seizure of the frozen Russian assets, and I commend the EU for making so many efforts to try to figure their way through the views of various members. I do think that we have to recognize that the question of freezing and then seizing and then deploying Russia's sovereign assets is a global security question. And it should be decided by people operating in a global security framework. I have nothing against Belgian bankers. I'm sure Belgian bankers are wonderful people, but the Belgian bankers are not the locus in which this important global security decision should be made. So I hope that we can continue to work our way through that to the extent that the concern is that there will be massive liability to Euroclear or to Belgium for having disbursed the frozen assets. One easy way to do that is to follow the rule of Repo 2.0 and start doling out the money in regular tranches. I think the rhythmic inevitability of 10 billion a month, 20 billion a month, going straight to Ukraine month after month after month will send, frankly, a more powerful message to Putin than doing it all at once, in which case you've shot all your powder and there's no longer further pressure. And it also tests the proposition that Russia will come to a legitimate court and try to bring a legal action and try to seek damages. If you're worried about that, start with a small tranche. And if they don't show up, well, that's a pretty strong signal. My personal view is that if you are a war criminal, the last place you want to show up is in a legitimate court in a legitimate country and give us the chance to basically litigate Russian war crimes in the context of establishing why it is that it is appropriate to seize these funds. This is a very exceptional circumstance. And I think that their threats about litigation are more threat than real. Oil revenues, of course, is the other thing that is propping up the Russian economy, and I don't think we've done anywhere near the good work that we should have with respect to the shadow fleet. We're in a position to know exactly what's going on with groups like SkyTruth, which I'm engaged with because of IUU fishing stuff that I work on, but I gather there's another group called Windward that is also very good, that knows where all these boats are. So we can trace them, we can track them. We can know when they spoof and jump suddenly 400 miles in an hour. And we can know when they're bellied up against another ship and likely to be lightering. And we can track whether or not they have insurance. I don't know of a port in the world that lets an oil tanker in to offload that does not have insurance other than in North Korea. So I think the insurance industry and the insurance support for these shadow fleet vessels is an important avenue of attack against that Russian revenue stream. And I guess last I'll say, if they can seize a Venezuelan oil tanker, why not seize a Russian one? I bet you can find a lot more illegitimacy around some of the Russian shadow fleet tankers than around the Venezuelan tanker. So I guess to the point of today, are sanctions effective? Yeah, I think sanctions are absolutely effective. But in the enforcement of those sanctions, you have to be dynamic and engaged and aggressive. If you are static, then the workarounds become the new pathway, and it looks like sanctions are not effective. Sanctions are effective, but the enforcement of them has to be dynamic and aggressive. And I'll close where I began. Ukraine having a victory here matters not just for Ukraine, not just for Europe, but for the world and for humankind, because the example of Russia being able to seize foreign territory against every treaty and succeed at that because the rest of the world said that's fine is a lesson that will echo shamefully in history's hallways, and we do not want to be part of that. Thank you very much.
My name is Simon Johnson. I'm a professor at MIT in the Sloan School of Management. I wanted to thank the senator, but he left a little too quickly for his amazing work and the work of his colleagues in the Senate on exactly these issues. It's really been fantastic, and I have some hope that they'll be able to carry that forward to great effect. Thank you very much also to Cece, who has also left, for the opportunity to speak here. And thanks to Robin Brooks and to Ben Harris and the entire team at Brookings for convening this timely meeting and for the outstanding work that's been done at Brookings on these issues. As you all know, on February 24th, 2022, Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The EU, the US, and the UK and their allies immediately imposed unprecedented financial sanctions in response. But Russia's devastating attack continued. This has caused some commentators to conclude that sanctions against Russia or other large countries just can't work. This conclusion is entirely incorrect. Now, more than ever, it is critical that we learn the right lesson, not the wrong lesson, from the past 4 years. And the right lesson is this. Exactly as Senator Whitehouse said, actually, sanctions can work, but only if they are enforced. And for enforcement to work, we need close cooperation within the G7 and particularly between the US and the EU. And for enforcement to be entirely credible and effective, the West has to be willing to incur at least some potential costs, although clever policy design can reduce those costs. Let me start by pushing back on the idea that sanctions are only ever an incremental tool that could never possibly be expected to alter the course of a war involving a country like Russia. Think back to February 2022, when Russia launched that full-scale invasion. Imagine if the West had imposed a full embargo on Russian energy exports. Two things would have happened. First, global oil prices would have spiked, potentially pushing the US and other advanced economies into recession. Russia, just to remind you, is the world's third largest oil producer, accounting for around 10% of global production. Second, and more importantly, Russia would have gone into a deep financial crisis. Oil is by far Russia's largest source of foreign exchange. The ruble would have collapsed, inflation would have soared, and Russia's financial markets would have seized up. It is very difficult to fight when your economy is imploding. Now, let's talk about what really happened. Right after the invasion, the West imposed those financial sanctions, including freezing Russia's official foreign exchange reserves. Russia was running a large current account surplus for years before the invasion, and it was important and entirely appropriate to prevent the use of Russian foreign exchange reserves, those reserves held in Western countries, for the purposes of financing this illegitimate war. This was absolutely a necessary step. But an exemption was granted for Russian oil and gas revenues as the West wanted to keep those fossil fuel exports flowing. A dangerous codependence had developed, and Russia obviously intended to make the most of that. In fact, let me remind everyone that oil prices spiked right after the full-scale invasion, raising the prospect that Russia's invasion could, from a Russian perspective, pay for itself. This would have set a very dangerous precedent. If oil-rich countries can cause oil prices to jump by invading their peaceful neighbors, the chances that we will see more interstate aggression around the world go up massively. The right Western countermove was exactly what we saw next. The G7, EU, and UK oil price cap, which was rolled out in December 2022, and which caps the price of Russian oil at $60 a barrel. And here, let me thank Ben Harris, Catherine Wolfram, now my friend at MIT, and everyone else at the US Treasury, then and now, who's worked on developing this. It's a brilliant idea and has been implemented and designed in a remarkable fashion. Congratulations on that. The key variable, however, is obviously the level of the price cap. In the event, this was set at $60 per barrel, which was below, although close to, the prevailing market price at the time. Russia, not surprisingly, continued to pump as much oil as it could. Why is this not a surprise? Because it needs the revenue to pay for the war. But the price cap of $60 was, in retrospect, in my assessment, too high. The opportunity to seriously shock Russia was unfortunately missed. If the level of the cap had been set at $30 or even $20 per barrel, Russia would still have had an incentive to export its oil, since that's above the marginal cost of extraction, which is around $15 a barrel in Western Siberia, and Russia needs all the dollars it can get. But its export revenue and its fiscal revenue in that lower price cap scenario would have collapsed. The ruble would have depreciated, inflation would have soared, and its economy would have struggled. Why wasn't the price cap set lower? Perhaps the people making decisions in the United States and Europe feared a disruption of supply and a spike in oil prices. It's possible that some senior policymakers may not have fully understood Russia's intense incentive to generate as many dollars as possible, or perhaps they just did not want to take the risk that the economic analysis was wrong. Or perhaps it was the influence of some European-based shipping companies, which feared that an aggressive cap would disrupt their business. My point is that none of these reasons for why the cap was set so high have anything to do with Russia. They're all about the West. They're about us. And the West's reluctance to do what was needed quickly to counter Russia's murderous invasion of Ukraine. Before I focus on the lessons to learn, let me say a few things about where we are now. The key insight is that most Russian exports of oil and oil product travel by sea. Every oil tanker can be and is tracked precisely in its movements. As you know, tankers sometimes attempt to hide their location by manipulating their identification systems. But every single tanker can be and is tracked by satellite, as well as by other means that I won't discuss here. These are very large ships, and you cannot hide where they pick up oil from Russia and where they take it. Now, the G7 price cap depends on Western ownership and control over the global oil tanker fleet. This was critically undermined by the formation of the shadow fleet, also known as the ghost fleet or the dark fleet. But this shadow fleet did not appear suddenly out of thin air. In fact, Robin Brooks and Ben Harris have documented exactly where this fleet came from. Half of these oil tankers were sold to the shadow fleet by Western ship owners, and most of these vessels came from Greek ship owners. It would be very easy to disallow such transfers of ownership, but in the latest data, it looks like these sales continue, actually to today. The result is that around half of all the seaborne oil now leaving Russia is on shadow fleet ships. The shadow fleet is a monster of the West's own creation, and it is a monster that is still growing. During 2025, the EU and the UK have done an outstanding job in sanctioning a large number of shadow fleet ships. And this is the figure now behind me. The EU is the blue line, the UK is the red line, and the US is the black line. In 2025, the EU sanctioned almost 500 Russian-controlled vessels, and the UK is not far behind. Unfortunately, while the US started 2025, as you can see in my chart, in the lead in terms of sanctioning shadow fleet ships, it has now fallen dramatically behind. Currently, there are 422 ships, counted by Ben and Robin, sanctioned by the EU and the UK that are unsanctioned by the US. 422 ships. The shadow fleet, unfortunately, remains very active. The shadow fleet is shown here in gray. So you can see it's at the bottom. You can see it was non-existent basically in 2022. You can see it rising. And you can also see the contraction in other shipping fleets, including what's labeled here as other Western, including what's labeled here as Greek. While the US has refused to join the EU and UK sanctions on the shadow fleet at the moment, at the end of October, the Trump administration did sanction Rosneft and Lukoil. Those sanctions had a considerable impact by pushing down the Urals oil price relative to Brent, sharply widening the discount on Russian oil. So in this chart, the Brent reference price is in black. The Urals price, which is actually paid as far as can be determined to the Russians, is in blue. You can see that prior to the full-scale invasion, those prices basically tracked each other. A Urals discount appeared after the invasion. The discount has gone up and down in reaction to various policy moves, some of which I discussed. And now in November 25, you can see that margin has increased relatively sharply. This discount, as a result of those American moves, has widened the discount and not put upward pressure on world oil prices. So you don't see Brent spiking after the measures taken against Lukoil and Rosneft. This is a very positive accomplishment, precisely because the threat of secondary sanctions deprives Russia of energy revenues. But that revenue will be squeezed even further if the US now sanctioned all the oil tankers that the EU and the UK have already sanctioned, the 422 ships that I mentioned. So what lessons do we need to learn from this very difficult experience? I would suggest 4. First, it's important to push back on the notion that sanctions don't work. The implementation of the G7 price cap was not forceful enough in the sense that the cap was set too high, in my opinion, and enforcement was insufficient. The shadow fleet was allowed to grow. But this is all about enforcement, not about sanctions, not about the design of sanctions, and not about the price cap, which, as I said, is an absolutely brilliant, innovative idea. Second, the most important underlying issue is always political. To the extent that the West did not set a low cap for fear of a spike in oil prices and a recession, look at where we are now. The desire to minimize the probability, and I would say the small probability, of adverse consequences in December 2022, when the cap was put in place, has cost the West and the Ukraine, and every country represented in this room, I would suggest, a huge amount over the subsequent 3 years. And if Russia is now allowed a favorable outcome from its invasion of a peaceful neighbor, we will just be storing up massive problems for our collective future. Third, the premise and the promise of the 1990s was simple. I spent that decade in the former Soviet Empire, and I remember those years well. I worked for the first Solidarity government in Poland. I studied the growth of entrepreneurs and private sector across the region. I spent a lot of time with some of my friends in the audience in Ukraine. I also spent a considerable amount of time in Moscow. After the fall of communism, the leading idea in Washington, D.C. and other Western capitals was integrating previously communist countries into the Western trading system would at least lead to better, more cooperative behavior and less aggression. This approach worked for many parts of Eastern Europe, where people were happy to distance themselves from the past. This approach has manifestly not worked for Russia, and, as Senator Whitehouse said, it may not work or have worked or be working for China. Fourth, and most important, if they behave aggressively against their peaceful neighbors, autocratic governments must not be allowed to benefit from the Western trading system. And when the West responds to that form of aggression, we need to do so decisively with measures that cut off export revenue for those autocrats immediately. We may be able to find better ways to achieve this goal, depending on the country and the circumstance, and this was exactly what was done with the price cap. It was a very well-designed policy for that moment and for that problem and for the issue of Russia. But we always need to follow through with enforcement. And let's be clear, there are always potential risks with an immediate response. But if we, in the West, don't respond immediately and decisively to that kind of aggression, we, the West, look weak. And in the medium term, the cost to all of us will be higher. And in my opinion, they'll be likely much higher. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I want to start by thanking Brookings for inviting me today, and it's always a pleasure to follow Simon because he lays things out so wonderfully, and hopefully I can add a few additional ideas to that as well. I'm going to be talking today about Russian oil sanctions and what the West can do, especially Europe, I think, in this case, to try to reduce both the shadow fleet, but more broadly to reduce the revenues that Russia is getting from the energy industry. And I'm going to focus on three things. I'm going to start by talking about the special role that oil and gas has in financing the war. I'm then going to talk about the underappreciated leverage that Europe has had in or over the Russian oil industry. It's been using that leverage, but there's more to be done still. And that's what I'm going to focus on in the third part of my talk. How can Europe in particular leverage its significant influence over the Russian oil and gas industry to further pressure Russia's wartime economy? So I'm going to get my slides up here first. There we are. So this is an overview of Russia's war funding over the last 4 years. It includes both budget revenues that they've gotten, but some additional revenues as well. And I want you to pay attention to the red bars at the bottom because that's the contribution from oil and gas. And as you can see, it was 50% effectively back in 2022. It has now fallen both in relative terms as well as in absolute terms to only about a quarter this year. That's effectively a collapse in Russian oil and gas contribution. A lot of that has to do with things in particular that Europe has done, and I'll come to those in a moment. But I want to talk about the strategy more broadly. When Russia discovered in 2022 that it suddenly had a big war on its hands and it would have extraordinary costs to cover that war, it had to come up with a strategy of how to fund those costs. And the strategy they came up with was actually pretty good for a while. It had two main pillars. The first one was maximize cash extraction from your oil and gas industry. You do that in part by spending down the massive savings that they had from past windfalls, but also really sweating the industry today through high levels of taxation, low budget spending, and siphoning all that money off to the war effort. It was a fantastic strategy if your war was lasting 2 years. But the war's gone on longer. The other thing that they did, again, a great short-termist strategy, was they unleashed the lending power of Russia's banks. And they flooded the Russian corporate economy with lots and lots of bank debt. That's actually what stimulated much of the growth that we saw in 2022 and 2023. But of course, there are limits on credit. They've maxed out that credit now. And the banks themselves are suffering a very big hangover from this huge lending spree that they've been going on. But that's a whole separate talk. Today we'll focus on oil and gas and tankers in particular. But if you think about it, it's a bit like, say, in a farming community, suddenly the farmer next door looks like they're doing very well, but it turns out that they've spent through their retirement account, they've maxed out all their credit cards, and they've been running down their machinery. And that's the situation Russia finds itself in 2025. Suddenly, this strategy, which looked very effective and fooled us all into thinking that Russia had this magical economy that was resilient, has suddenly gone into a steep decline. Now, let's talk about the role that Europe in particular has played in the shrinking of those red bars. So I spent 20-odd years working as an investment banker, but I was originally trained as an historian. And one of the things that I was working on before the full-scale invasion was a history of the Russian oil industry. And something I learned both as a banker and an historian is that the Russian oil and gas industry was really built first and foremost to serve Europe. It is almost, you can think of as a European business. The molecules may be in Russia, but the capital to develop them, the technology to develop them, and the big markets to sell them into, those are all Europe. And this is the same going back to the 1870s in the time of the Nobels, when they were first developing Baku, and you can track it decade by decade, all the way up to today. Now, what has happened, if you measure value as a banker would, to see what's happened with these red bars, a lot of stuff going on there. Some of it's oil price, but a lot of it has to do with specific steps that Europe has taken. First of all, they have denied Gazprom their markets. I'll come back to Gazprom in a moment, but I want to talk about technology first, just to give you an example. And for this, we need to go to our next slide. So, map. This is oil, but gas looks pretty much the same way. Flows of oil, and you can see almost everything goes west. The pipeline systems go west, and 50% of Russia's oil, these big green lines, those are actually to scale, goes out through the Baltic. And that's because that's where the demand was historically, so that's where the capital was invested. Now, what Europe has done is, well, actually, if we look way up here at 80%, see in the title, I can't even fit it on the screen. Russia's largest oil development project today is called Vostok Oil. It's up in the Taimyr Peninsula, $100 billion plus of capital. It's stuck now for a very simple reason. In order to evacuate the oil from there, they need a fleet of 50 ice-breaking oil tankers. They need to be built. The Russians can build, and the Chinese can build the double-hulled tankers that you need to go through the ice, but what they don't have is the technology for the special thrusters called azimuthal pods that have to go on the side. 2 European companies only have that technology, and so that project is now frozen. It was supposed to be the next generation of Russian oil, but here, it's European technology is denied, and it's really slowing down and weighing on the Russian oil industry. On gas, so Gazprom was making $50 to $60 billion a year off of its sales into Europe. In 2022, Gazprom was by far the largest single contributor to the Russian budget. 22%, almost $100 billion of the Russian budget was financed by Gazprom only. Today, Gazprom is bleeding cash, to use a banking term. In other words, their revenues cannot cover their costs, and they're losing cash every year. If anybody tells you Gazprom has returned to health, tell them, look at the cash flow statement. That's not the case, and that's because they've been denied the European marketplace. Even worse, they've been cut off from European capital markets. 3 months before the invasion, Gazprom raised a bond in Europe, 500 million euros. They paid less than 2% interest on that bond. Over the last 2 years, they've raised close to $18 billion to try and fund themselves. In Russia, they're paying over 20% for some of that money because they've been cut off from the deep, highly efficient European capital markets. And it is mostly Europe, actually, that does that. The US, we contribute some, but it's really European banks and European capital investors. So Europe has done quite a bit to help shrink that red bar, but it's been primarily by denying Russia access to valuable services, to capital, to technology, to markets. And you've gotten pretty much almost as much out of Russia by denying Russia things. The next step to squeezing revenues and squeezing the shadow fleet is to work with third countries who are actually receiving this oil, because they hold the key both to managing the shadow fleet down and the next level of squeezing Russian revenues. So you can see where the biggest line goes. It goes to India, because India stepped up and they were taking almost 2 million barrels a day of displaced European oil. There's some going to China, but China gets a lot of its oil from Russia from overseas, or rather by a pipeline. So The price cap, of course, we've discussed already. A lot of very creative thinking, challenging in some ways, as we've seen, to try to implement it when the Russians were trying to evade it. There has been a fundamental pivot now in October of 2025, away from a value-focused sanction like a price cap to a volume-focused sanction, where we're basically saying we're going to sanction 80% of Russian production. 80% of Russian production now between the 4 companies that are sanctioned by both the US and Europe, and here I include the UK with the EU, that oil is sanctioned. And Russia now has a fundamental challenge. Can they find enough buyers who are willing to take the risk of buying sanctioned oil? And here we see their conundrum. The big black line over there, that's the sanctioned output. That's 8 million barrels a day. The gray bars here are relatively sanction-friendly buyers. First, you start with the Russian market itself, but that's only about a third of Russia's total production that goes domestically. The rest gets exported. So you've got pipelines to China. Nobody is probably going to be able to stop that. And then you've got some Chinese importers by sea as well. But at the end of the day, when you go around the world and you look at all the potential markets who are willing to buy sanctioned Russian oil, you come up about 2 million barrels a day short. That's the red bit over here. And that's what Russia is struggling with right now. It's what Simon was referring to a moment ago when they said, he said the Russians are having to drop their prices to try and find people who are willing to buy this stuff. That's stranded oil, and it's going to become a problem going forward. The question is, how do you enforce companies or countries from not buying? We know in the case of India, just to go back here for a moment, that Indian refiners are not willing to buy sanctioned Russian oil if the United States is part of that sanction, because they're afraid of losing access to their dollar accounts. And if you're a big export-oriented refiner in India and you don't have access to a dollar account, you're pretty much washed up. The question is, what about Europe? Does Europe have that type of superpower as well when it comes to being able to put a choice in front of the world's buyers and say, are you willing, you've got to make a choice now. You can either buy cheap Russian oil or you can do business with us. Now, when it comes to the world of oil products and oil in general, Europe actually punches way above its weight. It has outsized power, and that power comes from 2 things. One of them is its markets, and second is its services. And Europe actually, and this comes as a surprise to some people, has started to use those much more effectively. I'll give you the 2 examples. There are sanctions coming in next month called closing the refining loophole. And what it basically says is that anybody who's at the end of this green line here, who's importing Russian oil and refining it, can no longer sell that oil into Europe. We're denying you access to our markets. Now, for many, this is going to become an economic proposition because remember, there's still some legitimate Russian, unsanctioned Russian oil out there. If I'm an Indian refiner, do I buy this and not sell it to Europe as the refined products that I make from it? Or do I say, no, I don't want to lose the European market, I'm going to stop buying this? And that's a price consideration. That's in part what's driving down the price of Russian oil right now, because they have to make it cheap enough that people are still willing to buy it. But then there's another superpower that Europe has, which comes back to what Senator Whitehouse was saying a moment ago, and I saluted him for this. It's insurance. Something as mundane as insurance is actually a real superpower. If you look at every oil tanker on the water today, over 90% of them are insured for oil spills through London, with large European reinsurers backstopping those policies. You may think, it's just insurance, but actually it's incredibly difficult to make work, especially on the scale of the global oil industry. And the Europeans, including Britain, they have dominated this space for a long time. All the big Chinese fleets, all the big Indian fleets, they all rely on European insurance to be able to operate. And by the way, most places, even today, well, let's go to the Russian shadow fleet, because we're going to talk about insurance now. Moscow understood back in May of 2022, they had a problem. They were losing their insurance. At that point, they had to, if they wanted to keep selling oil, they need to have their own fleet. They need about 600 Aframax ships. They had about 90, so they went into the marketplace and they bought up tankers. And this is month-by-month purchases since May 2022. This is it reflects some of the work as well that Robin and Ben have done. And they bought up a big shadow fleet in the second-hand market. But, and if you look on the next slide, you can see where it is today. The black bit is what they had in their own national fleet. The big, tall, red columns are what they've purchased. And they got up to about 500 ship capacity, which covered most of their needs. But these downward columns here show what's happened over the last year or two. A combination of attrition and sanctions. They've actually lost capacity, and they're down to about half of the power of their shadow fleet. It's actually, they're still buying some, but a lot of those ships have fallen out of use because of attrition or because of sanctions. And so now they have about half of the fleet they needed before, and as a consequence, they're only able to ship about half of their oil on their own fleet. They're still relying on Western insured ships to do the rest. So this raises a question. How can we use this to our advantage? And I want to pose, there are three specific moves that, that Europe can do. We talked a moment ago about the loophole sanctions. There's one other important sanction that the Europeans introduced back in October. Nobody's talked about it, but it's actually quite significant. There is a refinery way over in China called the Yulong refinery, which had been taking oil on Russian sanctioned ships. And that refinery was sanctioned back in October by the Europeans and in the UK. And it said specifically, it's because you are taking oil sanctioned, that we have sanctioned. This is the first example of Europe using direct sanctions on a refiner for defying their designations of shadow fleet ships. Now, it doesn't matter quite so much to that refiner because it's not Europe-oriented necessarily, although it is painful for it. The big question now is, what does that say to the large refiners in India and in Turkey, who not only rely on the European market, but they rely on all those ships that are insured through Europe to get their exports anywhere in the world? So, three tools that Europe has at this point. One is the Yulong tool, the Yulong refinery type sanction. This is to be able to use that effectively with refiners in India and Turkey, you need to have a conversation with them. That's more of a trade and commerce type of discussion. Here's what we're concerned about. This is what we're capable of doing. You have a choice. If you want to continue using our ships, you want to the ships that we've insured, have access to our market, have access to everything that we bring in the oil trade, we just like you to respect that sanction on the tankers and use tankers that are properly insured and properly maintained. So that's one tool that you have. A second tool that you have is, ironically, to actually impose a maritime ban on Western ships going into still lifting out of Russia. And many people say, well, won't that just cause the shadow fleet to grow more? Actually, the shadow fleet's very expensive. We see the attrition problems. It takes a long time to build it up. And what would actually happen is Russia wouldn't have enough tonnage to take all of its oil out. And so they would ration what they have, and most of that tonnage would end up going to service the Pacific and the Black Sea, and you'd probably see oil flows out of the Baltic almost collapse completely. So just because they don't have enough tonnage if you impose a maritime ban. The third thing you could do is actually take the 80% production ban and raise it to 100% and say everything coming out of Russia now is sanctioned. So these are three tools that you can use. They all have different risks. There might be a sequencing thing. There are pluses and minuses to each. But there actually is quite a bit more that can be done, even just by Europe alone. So what I want to leave you with then is this thought that when it comes to the Russian oil and gas industry in general, Europe actually has been punching well, I wouldn't say punching above your weight, but you've been using the immense leverage that you have There's a new tool now, though, not just denying Russia access to what you have, but denying people asking people who are buying from Russia to make a choice, us or Russia. It's time to choose. So I think that's the first and probably the primary lesson I would leave you with today. So it's very good to speak. Thank you.
So hi, everyone, both everyone who's in the room today and to the people who are watching live stream. Thank you for being part of this important event. I think we've had a terrific lineup. I've learned a lot, and I'm looking forward to this panel, obviously. So my name is Ben Harris. I'm Vice President and Director of Economic Studies here at Brookings. I've been looking forward to this event for a long time, since Robin and I conceived this several months ago. I obviously wish that there wasn't a demand to have this event. I wish the war in Ukraine was over. But I think that the fact that we're able to assemble such a terrific group today shows its importance and interest across European and the US government in ending the war as quickly as possible. So we have an incredibly distinguished panel today. We're joined by Swedish Ambassador to the United States, Urban Ahlin, Acting Deputy Head of Mission to the British Embassy to the United States, Lucy Ferguson, European Union Ambassador to the United States, Jovita Nelupshina, and Lithuanian Ambassador to the United States, Gediminas Varvuolis. So thank you for being with us. So for the rest of our time today, we're going to have a moderated discussion for about 40 minutes, then we're going to open it up to those in the audience to ask questions. So let's just get to a broad question off the bat. I'm going to ask all four of you this, and you can answer in whatever order you like. And let's just ask a broad question, which is, what is your sense of the state of the Russian economy today, and whether or not, and to what extent, sanctions have played a role in impairing Russia's ability to wage war? So all four of you can start. Go ahead.
Can I start?
Yes.
Because, first of all, I think the senators and Craig's and Simon's introductions were wonderful, really, really good. And I actually think that this discussion we have today is about the Russian narratives about certain things. The Russians trying to say that, oh, our economy is doing fine, you know, wow, we are living in a wonderful paradise. The sanctions are not working. I'm sorry, West, the sanctions are not working. And by the way, we are winning on the battlefield. And I have to say, I think all these three narratives are wrong. And I want really to say that because I think it's annoying at the moment where people are saying that Ukraine losing on the battlefield. We told the Ukrainians that you are not allowed to have long-range missiles. Don't shoot long in to the Russian territory, you know, defend yourself and so on. And that's what they are doing. And the Russians are winning meters after meters, but are losing a lots of men gaining this. Is that actually winning a war? No. It's actually about losing a war. And I can tell you that when I did my military service, the whole Swedish defense was built up in that way. We knew that the Russians could actually beat us, but we wanted to harm them so much it was not worth trying to take us. And that is what the Ukrainians are doing. So I feel annoyed when I hear that people are saying that, oh, it would have been better they made a deal 2 months ago than now because they're losing centimeters after centimeters. The real losers here are the Russians. The sanctions, they work. And as Simon said, you know, you need always to add, change, fix sanctions, because the one you are sanctioned is, of course, trying to circumvent it. It's nothing strange with that if it's 19 or 20 different packages. That's how it works. But it definitely works. And I'm very happy about Simon's and Craig's paper, you know, slides that they showed. It really works. The economy, and I think you, with the designs you had here where they financed the war, lots of money from the oil, and then it was, you know, kind of, yeah, where did the money come from? It's borrowing from the different banks. They have been spreading out money. And we see that lots of private banks are now bailed out by state-owned Russian banks. And if there is any Americans that are longing to have a wonderful relationship with Russia and go there and do lots of business, I'm going to tell you, be cautious, because there are lots of toxic assets in the banking sector in Russia. So yes, the sanctions are working, the Ukrainians are winning the war, and the Russian economy is soon to tank.
Thank you. Other reactions?
A lot of things already said. On the way, Russia lost around probably 450 billion of what they have. 200 billion at least are frozen in Europe, which are of course sovereign assets, and much more in private assets. For Russia is back actually spending 7 to 8% of their GDP for their military, which is more than in the Cold War times. The war in which was supposed, I just have to echo what Urban was saying. Russia is actually winning triple probably, because at first they went for the special operation for 2 days, then the special operation for 2 weeks. Now the war is actually longer than the Second World War for Russia. So they are stuck, and they are not fighting their major power. They are fighting their smaller neighbor Ukraine. It should be actually embarrassing, to say very diplomatically. Probably we can find another war, and they can continue. But let's not fool ourselves. They still can continue this war. The affordability question, which they are safe, which they are facing, actually is much different from affordability we are facing in our part of the world, because they have to squeeze civilians. You know, the way how they actually redirecting their resources and spending 40% of their public spending goes actually to their military. So maybe it's, you know, in the big country is possible to do that, especially if the country is not democratic, authoritarian, or even dictatorial. So then it can last for some time, but it's not really sustainable, and will actually, I agree, will tank at a certain point.
I mean, I fully agree as well with what has been said. And by the way, thank you. It's really nice to be here, and a huge thank you to our absolutely excellent speakers. I learned a lot from that as well. I think the ambassador and I have been equipped with the same fact that our calculation is actually that economic action on Putin to date has deprived him of over $450 billion. And that is equivalent to 2 years of funding the war against Ukraine. And I think that's a really, really important fact, and speaks for itself actually to a huge extent as well. The other thing I would say is, I think it was 3 or 4 weeks ago, Moscow announced its latest 2026 to 2028 budget. And this is where, as the ambassador to my right said, the facts speak against the narrative that we hear from the regime. Because actually, if you examine that budget, it is evident that the Russian economy is in real decline. You know, what you see in that is actually a real projection of decline in income and a budget deficit as well. So I think all of these facts really speak to the effect that sanctions are having on the Russian economy. I suspect we'll come on to energy a little bit more in the course of this conversation, but of course, in the way that we heard from our speaker, the way in which we have also really targeted Russia's energy is absolutely having an effect on its GDP, and I think we'll pick that up in a bit more depth. But that is something where I think kind of the action that has been taken collectively has had a real effect on how Putin is trying to do this war. So much more I can say, but some key points that really back up the fact that sanctions are absolutely working.
Oh, nothing really to add. I also fully agree that the sanctions, they work, clearly. Of course, probably we have to be realistic and say that they are not going to change the behavior of Russian, leaders right away, because if they are on a kind of sick messianic, mission to conquer Ukraine, and of course they'll go to great lengths and to the great amount of sacrifice in trying to achieve this mission, but clearly sanctions they work because they drain the resources of regime, make their life very difficult. Sanctions, they work for us as well because they help us to get rid of this kind of dependency that we used to have before. We saw those slides of east-west connectivity that used to exist over decades, and how we in Europe were dependent because of this infrastructure on Russia. So it all is changing, and it's a long-term change. Now we are not speaking east-west anymore in Europe. We talk more and more about north-south connectivity, about how to get rid of this northern route and go through the middle corridor as far as the transport connectivity is concerned, or energy connectivity as well. So this is the long-term benefit that those sanctions are having on us, and definitely crippling Russian economy as well.
Thank you. Ambassador.
Yeah, I would like to add to all this, because I actually think that we could have changed the Russian behavior if we would have been a little bit more dramatic and much harder in the beginning. And Simon asked the question, why is the price cap 60? I'm asking myself every day, why were we so weak in the beginning of the war by telling the Ukrainians that you're not allowed to have these certain weapons, you should not be allowed to hit the Russians in their mainland, you can only defend yourself. And I think the reason here is it's not refineries or shipping agencies and so on. It is that we have been nervous about the Russian reaction, that we have asked ourselves, what's going to happen if we corner the Russians really hard with long weaponry, or we push their economy really hard. We have been nervous that they're going to use, tactical nukes, or they're going to go totally crazy and do something. And that is the problem for us in the West, that we have been pushing slowly and steadily and increasing the pressure on the Russians, and by that trying to tame the Russian bear, not doing anything stupid. The Ukrainians are unfortunately now in the situation where the Russian narrative is getting hold, and we can blame ourselves that we were not more kind of pushy in the beginning of this, because I think the war would have been looking totally different if the Ukrainians would have the weapons that they have today in the beginning of the war. But I think that is the problem here with all the discussions that we have with the Russians, on the Russians, that we have been a little bit too nervous about the Russian reaction. And that have played a role in the sanctions, about the weapon we have sent them, and about price caps as well. So a lesson here would be, next time this happens, we need to be much more, fast forward and tougher.
So let me ask you about specific sanctions strategies at this point. And let's talk a little bit about the sanctioning of individual tankers. We saw the chart that was put up, I think, by Simon, which was constructed by Robin. We've been tracking every single sanction over the past half year or so, or perhaps longer. The EU and UK have begun leading on this and have now sanctioned hundreds of tankers, while the US, under the Trump administration, hasn't sanctioned a single tanker. But I think the broader question is this an effective strategy? And, or have we just sanctioned every tanker we possibly can, and it's a bit saturated and doesn't matter anymore? So when it comes to the sanctioning of individual tankers, what's your view on the utility of this strategy?
Well, I think that what we see in the picture, and that was in both of the presentations just before, it's clear. The thing is that we need to cut the revenues. We need to cut the tools which those revenues do. Well, to my taste, it would be good if we have done that, the next day the war started. Well, politically and due to other strategic reasonings, it was not possible. I think that we will, as the EU, will continue. Yesterday, our ministers of foreign affairs actually adopted again what we call small package, but in general, all the known shadow ships, which we will continue to do that. The next big package will come probably early February or mid-February. I think that what is important is actually to use all possible tools available to take out all the oil and gas from the market. Honestly, we are quite successful. 70% of seaborne oil is out of the market, and for the crude oil, 89%. So I always, when the people ask, is this effective or is this enough, I always suggest people to think, what would be the alternative? And the alternative will be at least 135 billion in Russian budget. What you can do with 135 billion, I think you can really bomb quite a lot.
Yes, and to add to that from the UK perspective, this has absolutely been a very intentional strategy on our behalf in terms of targeting the shadow fleet. I think the number we now stand at is that we have sanctioned 520 or over 520 oil tankers. Many of those we have done, in the company of our EU partners. And actually, I think it was in your article, your Substack article, you spoke about boosted overlap. That where this often has greatest effect is when it's not just, our own sort of regime operating, but where we are doing it in concert with others. And I think that is absolutely where we've seen this have greatest effect. A point I would add is that while this has also had an effect in terms of Russia's actual sort of export of energy, many of these tankers do also carry goods to the Russian military-industrial complex, and I think that's a really important point to remember as well, that therefore there is actually also a tangible impact in terms of how Russia is supporting itself and funding itself for its military action. So that is part of this that is hugely beneficial. But we feel this is something that has had an effect for all the reasons I say. But just to pick up a little bit on the conversation on the earlier point in terms of affecting behaviour, we do think this ongoing pressure on Putin is one of the means that does affect his behaviour. And I agree with what we've heard, that more decisive action in this space even earlier may have affected that behaviour earlier, but that in itself should be a reason why we absolutely need to remain as decisive and as bold as we can be, to particularly at this critical junction of where we are now, with his economy genuinely stalling. It is these sorts of actions that could actually bring him to the table more effectively as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. What can I say? We should sanction all of those shadow fleet tankers. I really liked your sentence that the shadow fleet is the monster of our own creation, and so we have a kind of moral duty to Ukrainians to do something about what we kind of enabled ourselves. So if it was for us, all of those shadow tankers should be on the sanction list in Europe, but in the United States, we very much expect U.S. to follow the suit as far as the shadow fleet, Russian shadow fleet is concerned, and just do it later, but better later than never.
And if I may add one sentence, we have to remember that we can actually sanction all the shadow fleets and every ship, but until we don't have this enforced by others, it's not only about the EU, UK, but we need to have US on board, but other countries which are usually quite supportive to our sanctions. And it's really straightforward, does not really have any kind of a political controversy behind that. Another element which we are actually, as the EU, following through, that those who are helping those ships to get oil or to get on board goods or to get, in general on the water, there should be as well sanctioned. So, it goes as like one ship. That means that you have to have a system of sanctions around that. That's why actually in our yesterday sanction list, you have companies not only listed, shipping companies not only listed from Russia, but as well UAE, Vietnam, and before that we had even the countries, the broader Turkey and others.
I would just like to add that I think that the point is that we should try more and more to tell the guys who is gaining money from this or doing this business that you have a choice. You're with the Russians or you're with the West. where do you want to make your money in the future? Don't, fool yourself now. For a short-term gain, you're going to lose big time in the long term. And there are lots of things we could do, to really make that case. When it comes to the fleet as such, I mean, we have played around with ideas about having a marine ban altogether, or a marine service ban, that no one is allowed to service these shadow fleets and so on, which will force people, to actually make a choice. Do I want to be in the Russian shadow fleet, or do I want to make money dealing with others? So there are lots of things we can do and strengthen and so on, but we are getting there. We're getting there. Absolutely. What I'm nervous about is actually that we are now letting the Russians off the hook with all, we have peace talks and negotiations, and we absolutely all want a peace, but we don't want a peace that will actually harm the European security architecture for decades to come. And it's really important that this plays out well, that the aggressor will have to pay a price.
Let me ask you about a point that Craig made, which I thought was quite astute, which was, the way he put it was, there's a shift from value to volume. So when we put again the price cap in the wake of the Russian invasion, I mean, you'd asked earlier, why was it 60? And I can give you my 2 cents on it. It was 60 because 60 is what we could get through the unanimous consent provision in the EU. 60 was also an opening bid. The idea was it would be a dynamic process and you could raise or lower the price cap as necessary, and Europe actually has. But the third concern was that at the time, when the price of oil was so high, that shutting in Russian production would actually be beneficial to Russian profits because it would spike the price of oil. This wasn't just a political concern with Ron Klain tweeting out the price of gas every day. It was a legitimate concern that was backed by some analysis. So at the time, there was analysis coming out of a major US bank which said that if you shut in Russian production, the price of oil will be $285 a barrel, which is terrible news for consumers and great news for producers of oil, including Russia. So Craig made the point that it seems like we're going from value, which is controlling the price, to volume, which is controlling, which is trying to diminish demand for Russian oil. And so you've seen the sanctioning of Rosneft and Lukoil by the US following action by the UK. And it seems like now we're shifting our strategy to trying to control volumes of Russian oil. So my question to the four of you is, A, is that correct? Am I interpreting that pivot correctly? And B, what's your outlook on this strategy? Should we go after buyers of Russian oil the way the Trump administration has put in place a 25% incremental tariff on India for purchasing Russian oil? Is this the way to go?
From a Swedish perspective, we go for everything that increases the pressure on the Russians. If it's price or, volume, or if it's going after the consumers, we go for everything. We are trying to find every little tool actually to increase the pressure.
And not so little, because I think what is happening in Europe, we not only sanctioning Russian gas, oil, and nuclear fuel, we actually legislating to ban it in general, and that actually will make illegal to buy Russian gas, oil, and nuclear technologies plus fuel. I think this is actually what's kind of, I see in the computers the map, but in general, this is what in the not even in the long run, in the medium run, because we are speaking about really only 2 years gray period for some things, which are then the sanctions will kick in next year for LNG, for example. So in general, we are cutting off the ties or the perspective even to come back to where we were back before the last phase of Russia's aggression in Ukraine. So in general, we are making unsustainable their infrastructure as such. And cutting oil is, of course, oil is more flexible, as just the energy secretary was saying. But if you cut gas, you're actually forcing Russia to keep it in the earth, inland, so they cannot really do anything with that. That's definitely getting out of there. And and there are other ways how really to send a signal, as it was mentioned here. We went after refineries, and I think this is the path again, that you not only go after the source, after technologies, after the tools, and after those who help, but as well you go at the demand side, and this is another element where you can actually curtail the volumes, not only the prices. So it's kind of you are enlarging your grip and influence, if I may put like that.
Yeah, a little bit like my colleagues. I think we should do everything. Target the volume, the value, and also look after other sectors, because of course we've been talking about oil and gas, but we know that Russia has this kind of excellence in nuclear energy. Rosatom is a powerful global company, and they're very active, going around the world, signing MOUs, especially in the third world countries, creating again those very long-term dependencies, because nuclear it's a long-term, industry, and so we have to be mindful and look at see those tendencies and maybe also go after Rosatom, because this is one other powerhouse that Russia has and which kind of has been overlooked so far.
And can I also say that like if I take off my ambassador hat now, okay, because. I think we are in a situation where Europe has actually learned the lessons. We cannot be dependent on Russian energy because they are ready to weaponize the energy. Certain countries have felt this absolutely clear. I'm talking about Germany. And that means that we are decoupling from the Russian energy resource. It's going to cost them an enormous amount of money and maybe teach them a lesson about invading a peaceful neighbor. I'm nervous, and that's why I'm taking off my ambassador hat. Are there other countries that would like to strike a deal with the Russians now? We're helping them out from this. That's what I'm nervous about. And now I put my hat back.
Maybe just a word from me on the Rosneft and Lukoil designations, because it was the UK that did that in October of this year, and then the US did it a week later, which we really welcomed. These are, of course, Russia's largest two oil majors, and they're the absolute lifeline of the Russian economy. To some extent, the impact of that, I think, is still, there's a lag. We still need to fully assess and analyse that. But it was pretty revealing that actually Lukoil's revenues, I think, plummeted by about 10 billion pretty much immediately. So again, this is action, it's targeted action, but speaking to everything you've heard from the panel, really finding these areas that can, speaking to your point of volume, can affect that and reduce Russia's profitability. It has been, already, I think we've seen the impact there.
But it's important not to keep the loopholes. When you put the sanctions, especially designate entities, it's important to give as little as possible licenses and possibilities to have financial transactions with equity of the companies.
Let me now ask you about Russian central bank assets. Senator Whitehouse made the point that he felt it was better to parse these out $10 or $20 billion at a time and welcome Russia and its role as a war criminal into a court and see how well that argument went. What's your view on what should happen next with the frozen central bank assets? Do you agree with Senator Whitehouse?
Personally, I don't think it is so easy as the senator was saying. I agree with a lot of what he said, but I don't think that will make the case that we are just distributing $10 or $20 billion a month. I don't think that is an easy solution to it. I'm pretty sure that the European Council in 2 days, 3 days?
Yes, Thursday, Friday.
Will take a decision
Thursday
on this.
late night.
And I understand the Belgians' concerns, that of course we all need to be collectively supporting Belgium if something happens and make that kind of risk sharing. I think that's absolutely fair. And I'm very optimistic that we will find a way to use these immobilized assets. How and how we're going to distribute it, what we're going to do. I mean, most of it, of course, to give the money to the Ukrainians so they can continue fighting the war, and also for the civilian purpose of the Ukrainian economy. And if we manage to do that, we will send a clear message to the Russians that we are in here for a long haul. And in my view, as I said, I think the Russian economy is soon to tank. I don't think they can actually bear that. If we are able to carry the Ukrainian economy a couple of more years, I think it's going to be disastrous for the Russians. But I'm eager to say also that I hope the Russian assets here in the United States will be used for the same purpose. I really think the American administration should do what they can as well to use the frozen assets here. So I'm pretty optimistic. I am pretty optimistic about that we will find a solution to this. But I don't think the senators, unfortunately, the idea is it's not that simple. I think we can fix it in the European Union by giving the Belgians the guarantees that they want.
I mean, we're certainly very supportive of moving forward on the plan on Russian sovereign assets. And I think particularly really the effect this will have on Ukraine's fiscal situation and how it can support them. It's a vital means of our support for Ukraine, as much of what we're talking about in terms of the pressure on Russia as well. We're not in the EU, but it's absolutely something that we're working on very closely with our European partners, and all eyes on the European Council this week.
Well,
So maybe before you, because you'll have to, as a EU representative, to make the overall assessment of the station. Just from my national perspective, of course, we really hope that we'll deliver on this next Thursday or more likely Friday. I really like the moral take of Senator on this, that we should not be afraid of seeing criminal in the court. I mean, what Russia is doing. I mean, this is criminal, and we should find ways how basically prepare ourselves to face this situation. And we owe Ukraine, of course, again, and they are in dire straits. They need this financial support, and I think if we deliver, the credentials of Europe as a kind of global actor and global power will rise, significantly. Because honestly, I mean, what can be put on the table? I mean, this is something that we can really bring into the situation. U.S. has a gun on the table. Ukrainians, they are fighting, but they also, negotiating on their own behalf. Europe, in order to be at the table, also has to bring something. I think with this particular issue, we can really come around and sit with all the others.
Before you, Vita, I think it's important to say that it's such a focus on these immobilized assets, like that's the only way forward where we can actually give Ukraine the money. That's not true. Europe has lots of financial strength. So even if we don't solve it, we will find another way to support it.
Thank you. You actually just made my intervention much more easier, because this is what I was planning to say. Like, we are speaking about EU and other countries' capacity to borrow. This is one thing, because what we are constructing, again, it's almost like oil price cap, a very creative solution. What we are constructing in general fund, which will be funded by the EU and probably UK, which is called, very symbolically, reparation loan. The idea is, of course, no interest, but we are not actually seizing the money. There's a legal issue in this. The money can go back to Russia once they're paying reparations. So in general, this is as well related to the thinking that you have to change the behavior. B, it sends the signal internationally, actually, for everyone as well, that you have to have a certain behavior not to lose your money, and in general gives flexibility for Belgium and other asset holders or local jurisdictions where those assets are actually possibility to have a legal protection, if I may put like that. The decision is extremely difficult. It's not like really so straightforward and so easy, but I don't see a reason why we should not do it. And it's not only about European strength, but we have to stop, as Urban was saying, listening to some kind of a strange Russian narratives, which are deceptive in general. If you open Russian media a week ago, where there was quite a lot written about frozen assets, the desperation is here. That actually, for me, is the clear signal that this is the right way to go. Because that means, and this proves all our numbers. We apparently have a shared talking points with UK, but you always can come back, don't worry. I cannot resist
You had
that.
it,
The sooner the better.
So, but it actually proves that the money they're losing because of the sanctions, the money they're losing because of the war itself, and the money they are losing because it's not really so nice to be cornered or be quite lonely in this war, actually gives a results or pays off on our side.
So let me ask you now about Belarus. Have we under-sanctioned Belarus? Have we not given enough attention, we, the G7, to Belarus's role in this conflict?
U.S. has lifted some sanctions on potash because of the release of, 135 political prisoners, which I think is a little bit naive, to be honest with you. Is that an answer enough?
It feels like an answer.
Yeah, seriously. I mean, Belarus is very important for the Russians, and the Russians are important for Belarus. I mean, it's no wonder that they are working together. And you remember in the beginning of the war, when the Belarusians actually created lots of problems for the Ukrainians because they didn't know if the Belarusians would open a new front against Ukraine. So they have, of course, played along with the Russians all the time. But I see that we have American negotiators going to Belarus and actually release, good that they got some political prisoners out. Remember, they were deported, though, out of Belarus, and there are lots of more political prisoners in Belarus, and there will be more to come. And I don't know if that's the right way to deal with Lukashenko, actually taking away sanctions from the American side. I think, personally, it's too early.
Well, thank you for asking the question. I mean, for us in Lithuania, this is kind of a very special issue. We have the longest border that we share, of all our borders that we share with Belarus, and of course we see what's going on on the diplomatic arena in terms of political prisoners, and of course we think that it's a major achievement to get especially from the humanitarian point of view, to get out those people from Belarus was important, and we applauded so towards, and actually we helped them in practical terms to bring those people across the border to Lithuania, and to then help them for their initial administrative matters on the EU side. But a little bit what my Swedish colleague has said, I think, this is important, and of course it's for US to see how measured the US approach will be in terms of getting out prisoners and then releasing some US sanctions. But as far as we are concerned, we think that actually nothing has changed in the Belarusian behavior so far that could incite us to also to do the same and to release those sanctions. The internal repressions, they haven't stopped. Democracy is still being undermined in Belarus. They are still very much enabling the Russian aggression in Ukraine. They are keeping some of those Ukrainian children in Belarus. They are actually they are also doing other things like this instrumentalized migration. They are sending people across our border, across the Polish border or Latvian border, and the most recent phenomena are those hybrid attacks that they have started in Lithuania by sending those hot air balloons, which are supposed to carry cigarettes, but we think that there might be a bigger design behind. just testing new technologies or whatever. So there are no signs that they are changing their behavior. Therefore, as far as our national sanction policy is concerned, of course, it will continue as it has been so far. And in general, I think we should speak more about aligning sanctions on Belarus with sanctions on Russia. There were some disparities, and they are getting closer, but there were some disparities before, like cars. After the war started, Belarus started importing like 2 or 3 times the amount of cars that they used to import before, which is clearly a sanction circumvention for Russia. Those cars, they go to Russia. Same by the way, for like refined oil products, like benzene, like the gas that you fill the cars. Again, we see that the exports from Belarus to Russia increased dramatically, which also shows that Belarus is being used for sanction circumvention. So again, we don't see any reason why the current EU sanction regime on Belarus should change. If anything, it should be reinforced, and we are very glad that in the latest EU Foreign Affairs meeting, there was this new criteria that was inserted in the sanction regime on Belarus, which is the hybrid, like if there are some hybrid activities that Belarus will use, that this will be also taken as a criteria to impose new sanctions. So this is where we are.
Well, yeah, so yesterday we introduced new sanction criteria for foreign interference, the interference against critical infrastructure and disinformation, or FIMI, it depends how you call that. This list is still empty. It should be filled in with those who are accomplice. I think that sometimes we lose the sight why Belarus is sanctioned since the beginning of the Russia's aggression in Ukraine. First of all, their territory was used for one of the first attacks, for the assault. So this is not really something in between. This is very clear. Secondly, in order to go after their political opponents or opposition, they actually forced their plane down. They kidnapped the full plane of people,
Yes.
and then it took negotiations to release them. They create a problem. This is a very Soviet-style thing. They create a problem. They put 1,200 plus people in prison, and then they released some of them, and we are paying for that. I think it's not really a right approach. That's why EU has a different position. In the same week, when the US decided to review their sanctions, EU actually strengthened the sanctions vis-a-vis Belarus, and I think that then it will be the question probably in half a year or a year, we can have the similar conversation and see how effective it is. Every time when we actually have a diversity in our sanctions, or diversity, what sanctions we apply for Russia and Belarus, it becomes extremely difficult to implement and to enforce. And everybody remembers, that Belarus is right now the biggest producer of shrimps, without having a sea.
I fully agree with what you said, that they create a problem, and then they want to negotiate in kind of good spirit. They release prisoners, but then they take other prisoners on the other end in Belarus.
Yeah,
like they.
That's what they did.
Yeah,
After the first batches,
they steal thousands of our trucks, like Lithuanian trucks, because we closed the border because of those balloons, and now they say we want to negotiate about those trucks on political level. But in the first place, they took them, and they do not release them. So this is very much what Jovita has said. This is in their kind of mentality of how the negotiations should be carried on.
And I think there is a misunderstanding from the American side here, that you will be able to kind of band away Belarus from the Russians. You will be able to band away the Chinese from the Russians, and so on. I think what we need to learn is actually that the behavior that we have had, and I mean West, EU and US, have actually emboldened them. And you know, if we don't make this right, then the Russians will have to pay a price for it. I'm afraid that it has gone in a totally different direction. It's going to be much harder to work with them. So I think it is, you know, a miscalculation from the American side. Simple as that.
And we've been there already before, not once, not twice with Belarus. Like there were those attempts to normalize relations.
I was actually part
at least
of it
2 or
myself.
3 peaks in the past.
Yeah, I was actually part of it myself. I was appointed by Condoleezza Rice once upon a time to negotiate with the Belarusians on the Americans' behalf to release the presidential candidate Kazulin that was thrown into prison by Lukashenko. And we had this kind of attitudes and discussions at that time as well. And I think we are too naive.
So, American naivete is a good segue.
I said we. I said we.
Okay.
Yeah, I said, but I meant U.S. Yeah.
It's a good segue into my final question before we open it up to the audience, which is, what are you looking for from the U.S. in terms of further actions in the near term?
Align. We sanctioned like 560. UK sanctions 520. You mentioned aligning on the different levels of sanctions. Look, there is another element. We were kind of referring back and forth to the enforcement and how sanction works. I think that we have last year, probably mid of last year, we have reached with US and the very good US, UK, Japan, very good cooperation on how we go about in our cooperation vis-a-vis third countries to make sure that they actually do not help to avoid sanctions. So, like, you know, the regions in Central Asia, in the Gulf countries, and many more. So when we actually worked as a group to enforce the sanctions, those sanctions were much more effective, and we saw the results actually. So I think that there's only two elements: align and enforce together. Because the sanctions never work. Like, you know, we can put whatever we want; it will never work if there is no group effort.
Maybe we'll start down here and come this way.
Okay.
Yeah. So what do you expect from US? Well, a little bit more of what Jovita said, but on top of that, the senator referred to this Graham package, you know, bill that has the support of 85 senators. So we just, you know, we hope that eventually we'll get there and it will be tabled and it will be debated and
this is the 500% tariff for any purchaser of Russian oil.
Except for Europe and UK.
Is
I
it
think-
still 500? I don't think
Yes.
it's 500 any longer.
It's still 500.
Is it still 500? Wasn't Graham talking about 200 the other day? Okay. All right.
So look, I would say everyone here wants peace for Ukraine, and we want that in Ukraine's interests, in the interests of European security, in the interests of global security. This administration wants peace for Ukraine as well. Right now, you know, today, discussions are still so live and sensitive in terms of some of the efforts that are going on to achieve that peace. But from our position, alongside that, in the way that I really hope everyone has heard today, keeping up the economic pressure on Putin remains absolutely one of, not the only, but one of the ways that the US will also be able to achieve their goal of getting him to a table and securing a just and durable peace for Ukraine. As we've just said and heard, we have all taken action that has been hugely effective. And again, I hope we have convinced you of that today. That action will be far more effective with the US on board and aligned. The way that they took action on Rosneft and Lukoil, I think, was really significant. We know they can do that we know there are many other options they can have, including Graham's bill. And so, yeah, that's my answer, is really if they can join us in some of that space, then I actually think collectively we can achieve the goal that we're all trying to do.
Thank you. I fully agree with my colleagues on this, but I would like to end where I actually started. I would like the Americans to be not fooled by the Russian narratives that the Russian economy is good, that the sanctions are not working, and that they are winning on the battlefield. Nothing of that is true. And I really hope that after we have a just and fair peace, that the Russians will be forced to pay a hefty price for what they have done. Otherwise, we start, like kind of give a precedence or embolden countries like China and others to do the same thing. So that's what I want from the Americans.
Let's open it up to the audience for questions. Please make it quick. Please state your name and your affiliation, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. Let's start here.
Hi, I'm Melissa Lawford from The Telegraph. I was wondering if you have any sense that all of the economic pain that Russia is feeling is bringing it any closer to making serious concessions in peace negotiations, because that doesn't seem to me to be what is happening at the headline level. I'm wondering how much closer the Russian economy needs to be to collapse before it starts being serious at the negotiating table.
Do we take
Would you take a few questions?
How do you want to run?
Let's take 3 or 4 questions, and then we'll answer them. Let's go here, and then there.
Hi, I'm Daniela Cheslow from Politico. Thank you so much for being here. I wondered what you're hearing about U.S. pressure being brought to bear on EU countries when it comes to using frozen Russian assets.
Okay. And the third one right there.
Samantha Gross, Brookings Foreign Policy. I haven't heard any discussion of global oil markets this morning.
Global
oil markets, sorry. Today we're moving towards a global surplus of crude oil. And this opens more space for the political palatability of greater sanctions on the Russian oil industry. Are policymakers in Europe and the United States really understanding that markets matter for the political price that you pay for sanctions? And that now is a fantastic time to strengthen sanctions policy because oil markets are well supplied and prices are relatively low.
And the last question back here.
Thank you. Charles Litchfield, Atlantic Council. I was wondering if the panel could tell me, both for the EU and the UK, how confident you are that you would maintain sanctions if the US were to lift them.
Okay, so we have 4 questions. Does anyone want to take a crack? You could choose from the questions. Okay,
no, I can say yes. I'm absolutely certain the EU will continue with the sanctions because we are, at the neighborhood at the Russians. For us, the European security architecture needs to be there, and the only thing we can do is actually to push the Russians. So I'm pretty confident when it comes to that. When it comes to the Russians and the economy, I'm sorry to say that personally, I do believe that when Putin talked about Novaya Rossiya and his idea, that is an ideological thing. He is ready to throw lots of people into the meat grinder. He is ready to make the Russian people extremely poor just to achieve that. He's not wanting to come back to the Soviet Union. He wants to come back to the Tsarist Russia. And he has already told us, if we would have listened carefully, we would have understood that he is looking to kind of do this expansion for Novaya Rossiya. So I'm very pessimistic. I really think it has to have an enormous impact on the Russian society before Putin will change his view. So I'm not super optimistic that we will have. Maybe we'll have a ceasefire, play for some time, but as long as Putin is there and his entourage, they will absolutely look for Novaya Rossiya. From the American side, I would say that the message we have is clear. It's up to the European Union to decide what we want to do with the immobilized assets. They don't have a pro or they don't have a no. I mean, it's up to us to decide. It's on a European soil, so to say. So it's up to us how to decide. And the global oil market, I leave to someone else. It's too complicated for me.
It is complicated, but it sounds like a great point actually that we might have missed. Absolutely, we have to be more active in the global markets. Putin is active. Touring around, going to India, trying to convince Indian authorities to still take his oil. Well, we should be equally active, in the Gulf countries, OPEC countries, talking to them about lowering the price. We should fight for the hearts and minds of countries that are out there, in the world. to make sure that they are on our side, including the oil producers in the Gulf primarily. And on the Atlantic Council point about whether the EU sanctions will continue if US stops their own sanctions, I think we are kind of bound already by our own decisions that as of the beginning of next year we will be forbidden basically from buying hydrocarbons from Russia, which is a huge achievement. So, which means that it is going to continue from our side. Correct me if I'm wrong, Evita.
No, you are right. I cannot correct the member state ambassadors, but
we are old colleagues, so you can do whatever you want.
So, look, I think that coming back to on energy or the previous relations with Russia in the energy sector is not really feasible, not only because of sanctions. The thing is that one of the ways how Russian fossil fuels were getting through was Ukraine. This one way was cut as of last January. Lots of countries in the EU actually, and in particular those which were kind of a transit countries, they actually don't have infrastructure or the infrastructure is not maintained. Yes, you can always rebuild infrastructure, but it's costly and it will, again, take time. Well, Nord Stream 2 is actually sanctioned by Congress. It will take actually congressional vote to review that. It's not enough just executive decision. So, and on top of that, EU, as I said, we have a law right now. So to unvote in the European Parliament, undecide in the Council, and untable for the Commission the proposal. So sorry for my Eastern European English, but this you have to imagine what kind of the process it will take. And I think that the lesson learned across Europe is in general dependency and vulnerability. German economy already paid a huge price actually for de-risking and decoupling of the dependency on energy. It's not possible, like it's possible technically partially to come back, but in full percentage, it's not actually possible to do that. And I think that it's, and energy or fossil fuels in general is the biggest bulk, money-wise or value-wise, the sanctions. There are other elements, SWIFT, banking sanctions, which are important. But money-wise, it's actually it's the main part, and it's impossible actually to come back. That actually goes to the crude oil markets. We can discuss how the market situation is. But EU actually already sanctioned 89 approximately % of Russia's crude oil. I think what is important. To have an effect, you actually have to go broader. It's not enough to sanction crude oil. You have to actually go to after refineries and those who are actually using that, with all the considerations in mind that it can be, it can be painful, it can be push the price peaks, it can unravel certain arrangements with the third countries and so on. But I don't really, how to say. I think that everything is on the table. It is possible to go to the last 11%. We need a cooperation with some countries as well in Gulf region to make sure that it works as well. China, India comes in mind when we think about it as well. I already spoken about if Russia's economy will collapse. I don't think Russian economy will collapse, and if there is an interest or need for that. But economic pressure should be maximized to the point that the decision making, not only by Putin himself, but his surrounding, will be painful enough to to push this last mile. And the thing here is as well that right now pain is not felt by big cities. And we can think and say about the current Russian leadership what we want, but they are smart enough to understand that they cannot really go after their own big cities. That's why the military mobilization is not happening there. That's why actually electricity and heat supply is always there, because you imagine St. Petersburg and Moscow without heat as part of Ukraine is going right now with this weather condition. It would be the thing.
I agree with that final point. I think one of the difficult aspects that we have to contend with is that whereas we can sort of see the picture that Russia's economy is declining and destabilizing, perhaps some of those around Putin can see that as well, but the picture he is being presented with and seeing is probably somewhat different. And so I think that's sort of an aspect that we are having to contend with. Nonetheless, absolutely, keeping this up so that it becomes harder and harder for those around him to not present that picture is a sort of core part of this. And in many ways, the answer to your question, we will find out in coming days and weeks. The Ukrainians have engaged in hugely good faith and hugely constructively over the last few weeks. The ball will now absolutely have to be in Putin's court as to whether he is going to do the same. Someone asked about maintaining sanctions. As you've heard, sort of lifting sanctions, and others in the room will be far more expert than me, but that's a hugely sort of complex legislative process. It's not something that happens overnight. And while we continue to make the judgment that it is in Ukraine's interest, that it's in Europe's interest, the world's interest, that we have the sanctions that we have, we will absolutely maintain our sanctions, of course.
Everyone, thank you for joining us for this incredibly important event. Please join me in thanking our distinguished panel. We're very grateful for your time.